Welcome to School Finance. This is another lecture that's intended to help students understand a little more about the Kentucky school funding and allocation formula called SEEK. So we're going to proceed through an overview of SEEK, and then there will be another follow-up video that will focus attention on 4 districts and how SEEK monies are allocated in those 4 districts. Before we start, though, there are 3 resources in the content section of Blackboard that may be helpful to students that want to learn more about the Kentucky SEEK funding formula. The 3 resources are titled, the first one is titled Kentucky School Funding Explained. That is probably the most thorough and one that really goes step by step through the different elements of the funding formula and allocations. The second is a little more basic, and it's called that, the Basics of School Funding. And the third one is called Kentucky School Funding Formula Analysis. All 3 of these provide a really good explanation of how funding works at the state level, and of course how funding is distributed to districts and schools in Kentucky. And as I said previously, there also will be a district SEEK report that is in the content section that we'll have in a follow-up video. So we're going to begin and hopefully advance the beginning of this presentation that is really all about SEEK funding, Support Excellence in Education in Kentucky, and this is the funding program that was developed during KERA, the Kentucky Education Reform Act in 1990. And it really focuses on how funding flows and the allocation of funding, and then even the role of site-based councils and how the needs assessment process works at the district level. And so let's start with SEEK funding. As we've defined it, supporting education excellence in Kentucky. It's composed of 3 parts or levels. First of all is the base level, Tier 1 and Tier 2. The state guarantees a base level of funding per pupil. That base level is currently an amount of $3,981 per pupil. That is set by the General Assembly. It is set in the budget, the state budget that is passed every other year. This spring we'll be going back into, or winter we'll be going back into a budget year to determine what the SEEK base funding is. So each school district's base funding is adjusted based on several factors. The number of at-risk children to be served. So there is an add-on for at-risk children because it's more expensive to serve them. The number of exceptional children to be served, and there are different levels of exceptional children, mostly special education students, but also students that have that are language learners, and then the cost of transportation, based on another formula for how far and how large the district is. And then the last one is the number of children who are homebound or hospitalized. So the base allotment requirements, there is a required local participation. In other words, all local districts must assess at least a 0.30 per 1,000 of assessed property. So when you get your tax bill, you see the value of your property by the local property valuation administrator. Your tax is based on a level set, in this case 30 cents per $1,000 of assessed property value. That's the minimum. Most districts are far above that. Many of them are way far above that. But the minimum to participate and actually get state funding is to at least assess 30 cents per 1,000. And then the district has the ability to raise taxes in the following ways at the local level: through property taxes, which we've already talked about, property values; occupational taxes, which are taxes on wages. Some districts have that, many cities and county governments have that as well. There's also a utility tax and then an excise tax. If the assessed valuation does not generate the base allotment per pupil, the state supplies the difference. And there are some examples, particularly in the more rural, far eastern parts of the state, where this is the case. Tier 1 is an additional pot of money that comes from the state level, and this is something that can amount to an additional 15% that is above the SEEK base allotment. So it's additional state money, and Tier 1 is typically based on the overall wealth of the school district. So the guaranteed base for Tier 1 is 150% times the statewide average of taxable property per pupil. What that means is that you have a really property-rich district like Fayette County. They're not going to receive this money because their average is well above that. But you have poorer districts like the district that I represent in Owensboro that has a property value that is 150 times the statewide average. So we don't have the property values, and so part of this Tier 1 is a way to equalize and give those areas that have less property value a better way to fund their schools. So the district raises revenue on its assessed valuation, and the state supplies the difference. So there is both a local and a state part of Tier 1. Tier 1 is a little hard to understand, and as we walk through the district SEEK reports from the 4 districts, I think it will become more clear to you. So if it's a little fuzzy, hang in there. Tier 2 is actually just local dollars, and districts may raise additional local dollars above that base allotment. Voters in the district have to approve it in a referendum, and it is, as I said, strictly local dollars. No state funds are provided. So let's talk about the different funds that you see in school districts, and first we'll start with the general fund. This is really sometimes referred to as the SEEK fund, and it's the sometimes if you look at budgets, when you looked at your budgets from different districts, they refer to Fund 1. Fund 1 is the general fund, and it consists of both state and local revenues generated through the collection of property taxes, utility taxes, occupational excise on income, and then it also sometimes can include other revenues from state and local or some federal and state sources. Section 3 funds are administrative expenses. This is the funds that come to operate the district, sometimes referred to as Section 3 funds. So district-wide expenditures are basically taken out of the general fund, and district-wide expenditures include things like administration, attendance, operating all facilities, transportation, food service, all the construction that's done, the instruction department, which includes special education at the district level, health services, maintenance of the plant, community services, and debt service. If we bond bonds and you pay those bonds off through debt service, that all comes at the district administrative level in your school district, and that's called Section 3. There are also a series of categorical programs in most districts, and these programs are also subtracted from the general fund. Many of these programs have restrictions on these funds set by the different funding agency or authority. Many of these are federal grant programs. They include things like Title I, which is essentially monies for poverty, students in poverty. Title II, which is teacher quality. And there are several different variants in title programs: Title IV, Title VI, special education, class size reduction funds, which is an older kind of funding system that doesn't exist anymore, and then federal funds for preschool, homeless education, and then of course there are several state grant programs, and these state grant programs include things like ESS, Extended School Gifted and Talented Funds, what used to be called textbook funds, now called instructional resource funds, professional development, bus driver training, and family resource youth service centers, and of course school food service and CATS, the Kentucky Education Technology System. So these funds are all also subtracted out of the general fund before anything gets to the school level as you build the budget. Many of these are also run through Fund 2, which is typically grants. Then we get to Section 4. So Section 3 are all funds that are district-wide funds, whether they're grants, whether they're local money, whether they're state money. All of those are considered to be district administrative operations. And Section 4 is where you fund teachers, and this is where your staffing allocations, and we'll get into staffing allocations a little later in the course, and they're based on enrollment. And typically there are ratios that determine what the teacher to student ratio is at all grade levels, and that's how you fund teachers. The allocations essentially meet the cap size requirements and other positions generated by staffing policy at the district and at the site-based level. Section 5 funds fund your classified positions, and those classified staffing allocations are also based on formulas that are set, in this case, by board policy. And then you have Section 6 monies, and Section 6 monies are those monies that essentially they fund instructional materials. And these are instructional materials that is based on the prior year ADA, average daily attendance, and the district essentially divvies these out based on board policy, and essentially it is only increased or reduced at the end of the second month if your ADA changes significantly. And then Section 7 is essentially the remainder of your budget. All the funds that are left over, the balance of the amounts generated in Section 4, 5, and 6 are distributed to the site-based council in something called Section 7. Section 7 is, there's really a lot of discretion. If you're on a site-based council, you've seen Section 6 and Section 7. That basically is your school budget. Part of your school budget is given to you in the form of staff, but you never really see that on a balance sheet. That's just your allocation of teachers, your allocation of support staff and certified or classified staff. Really, the money that you get in your school that formulates your school budget is your Section 6 and your Section 7 monies. And again, this is typically an amount based on a per pupil, driven by your ADA, and based on the pupil needs that are identified by your site-based council. In many cases, a combination of the two. Professional development funds are allocated by the superintendent based on the 10th month of enrollment. And at least 65% of the district's per pupil state allocation for professional development should be given to the local schools through the site-based council to be used. And of course, this is an allocation that's included and given to the council by March 1st every year. So let's talk a little bit about budgeting and the budget cycle that you see in school districts. Step 1 is typically the needs assessment. Step 2 is typically giving allocations based on what the budget projections are and how those budget projections come down. And then step 3 is actually building the budget. And it is a process that begins with at the school level and at the district level, talking about what the needs of the budget are and what the needs of the district are. And the budget is the end result, and it is not created until after a needs assessment's been completed and the funds have been allocated to the district. And of course, there's a lot of different factors that are based in this, and you start with it in January typically. Actually, the needs assessment sometimes starts even in October, November of the prior year, and then in January, the beginnings of the budget is built. It looks a lot like the prior year budget. And then you begin to look at staffing allocations typically in March, and they're revisited again in May when you kind of figure out what your projections based on state numbers are, based on enrollment projections are, based on staffing projection. So the May budget really is a closer shot at what that looks like for the following year, that the fiscal year that starts July 1. So you really start building that budget that starts on July 1 of a fiscal year the previous October with the needs assessment, and then the initial swipe at the budget in January, and then March 1st giving allocations to schools based on staffing, and then in May the Board of Education approves the budget that really is the working budget going in to the July 1 fiscal year. And then the board will again revisit that in September based on ADA. If your enrollment ends up being a lot larger or a lot smaller, then adjustments, of course, will have to be made. And so that's a cycle that goes on every year. And as you can see, people in finance positions and superintendents and even principals to a lesser degree are juggling 2 or 3 budgets: the prior year budget, the coming year budget, and the current year budget. And so that can be a very difficult thing. Typically, stakeholders should be involved in the needs assessment, reviewing different data sources, analyzing causes and contributing factors, and looking at priorities based on your strategic objectives and goals to set the budget. Site-based councils and boards of education are involved, but at the school level, site-based council approves the budget to address the goals that are set up. So this concludes our first overview presentation about the SEEK funding in Kentucky. And as I said earlier, there will be a follow-up that will walk through this at the level of several schools and districts.